So this next one is going to be the couch, and I've put this onto a time lapse so that I can just quickly talk over it and explain the different techniques and methods that I'm using, so that you guys can rather have a slightly shorter video than me going through hours and hours of modeling of this. The initial video length, initial recording, was about 40 minutes long, and this one is much shorter, just for convenience's sake. So at this point, what I'm doing is I'm blocking out the volumes using a single cube, and I've turned on the symmetry in the modeling toolkit so that I have the ability to essentially model both sides at the same time. And just adding enough definition and details along the edges of the model so that obviously that you only capture what you need. There's no need to go ahead and really add too many edges along the model that you're never going to use for other details. So I'm using the insert edge loop tool or the multi-cut tool just to kind of cut through those shapes. And so what I'm going to do essentially is extrude some shapes and then grab certain other areas, like at the back over here. I'm going to refine it and then eventually start extruding those shapes up. This way I'm going to end up with the back piece for the back support. I'm pulling this up and moving it kind of backwards, skewing it in, and then eventually I'm scaling it out. So I found a little bug in Maya 2015. Unfortunately, I couldn't figure out how to get it to work properly, whereas the modeling toolkit somehow doesn't scale properly when you select faces or edges. When you scale things to flatten out the edges or the faces, it kind of doesn't really give you the full scale amount like it's supposed to. So at this point, you can see I'm trying something, and I'm trying to see what's the best method of going about it. I'm merging the components together, trying to line things up, snap aligning to the front vertex, and then trying to bridge those edges together. And I found at the end that the shape that I ended up with for this particular area wasn't really what I was looking for. So I ended up deleting all of that and just bridging it up to the top face section of the armrest. So I'm selecting those edges and bridging them. I'm filling the gaps. And just to quickly explain how I get to those tools, if you hold down Shift, you're essentially going into a context mode that reads what type of component you have selected, whether it's edges, faces, or vertices, and that allows you to then use the specific tools that cuts the model up or adds specific details, and it's only going to give you tools related to the type of component that you're in. So Shift hotkey allows you to do that. And here next I'm actually using some sort of a mirroring tool. It's called the Proxy tool, and I'm changing up some settings to create a mirror copy, and I ended up saying, no, I don't like that. I'd rather use something like the instance geometry, and I'm putting up the scale to -1 on the X so that it mirrors across to the other side. So whatever I do to one side is then applied to both sides at the same time. So that's very convenient, and allows you to easily model two things at the same time, purely because I felt like I don't need to see the full shape while I'm working, so I ended up not using the modeling toolkit. It's just different ways of approaching it. There's not a right or wrong way when you're doing mirrors, when you're mirroring geometry. Again, I found a little bug. I couldn't figure out why the scale tool wasn't really scaling properly using the modeling toolkit scale tool, and I eventually just gave up and tried to manually move the components, get it to line up properly, and then after that I started creating the supports for the couch, and lined those up, got them into position, dragged out the edges, and started refining the volume. Did some extrudes, pulled that up. Most of these functions and tools I'm all accessing through hotkey menus. I'm not using, or rather marking menus, I'm not using the traditional opening a menu at the top and then trying to find the tool. I highly advise you guys to actually try and get into the habit of accessing all your tools that you need via either the modeling toolkit or via the marking menus. Now, if you're not sure what I mean by marking menus, it's essentially the right click menu set that pops up as soon as you hold down right click. Now remember, you've got hotkey combinations that you can use together with that. If you hold down shift like I said, or control, you're going to access the different tool sets for you to manipulate the model according to its type of component that you have selected. So I'm smoothing it out, I'm checking the volume, and I'm eventually going to delete the top cap. And then I'm using something called the set normal angle. What this allows you to do is actually choose a degree of angle for the normals to be smooth, and if it's more than that, then it's going to essentially just keep it hard edged. If it's within the range, it keeps it nice and soft. So I'm making duplicate copies, moving it to the other side, and there we have it. At this point, I decided to add some extra refinement. I went in, refined the shape a bit, grabbed some edges, beveled them. Over here I'm just adding extra supports, and then I decided to finally bevel it. There we go. So that gives it a nice rounded edge, and I felt like, okay, well, if the inner side is nice and round, why not the outside, according to the reference. Keep on refining it over and over, adding some extra bevels on the side. At this point I felt like the back was too thin, or too thick rather, and I need to refine those edges first, moving those components along their normal angle. Okay, and at this point I felt like now it's time to bevel it. So I smoothed it out, I checked the shape, and I felt like it's collapsing in too much on itself, and I'm adding support edges along the borders of where I wanted to have it maintain curvature a lot more. So I'm dividing this up this way, and I'm checking the shape constantly to see and evaluate whether I'm getting the right result. There we go. I was looking good. I was happy with the result, and at this point I felt like, hey, why not creating the pillows? And I'm actually making use of the duplicate face tool. You can access that via the shift right click menu. Again, when you have a certain set of faces selected, you can actually duplicate those same faces off of the surface of the model, actually making a perfect copy of existing parts of a model. The cool thing about this is you don't have to recreate a brand new polygon plane and trying to match it within the dimensions of the area that you want it to work. So this way you're just spending much less time trying to get to the initial point of the creation process. So now I'm scaling it up again. I'm having issues with the scale tool not working like it's supposed to. Ended up scaling it out from the center. And then I started refining it. Took these edges, refined those, pulled them in, and try to get that billowing effect on the front of the pillow, so it kind of feels like it's kind of matching in with the reference. Trying to fit them in and refined the edges, tweaked it in, pulled it up, trying to get it to work nice. Adding support edges, and then I went into the sculpt geometry tool and I put it to push, or rather pull, which will allow me to pull along the normal angle as long as you set the options to normal direction. And then essentially you have a brush that you can then go and sculpt on directly on the model, and that allows me to then refine the shape and give it a more organic kind of look. I mean, those pillows aren't all the same perfect evenness all over, but I still wanted to keep it kind of in a generic area where when I duplicate this across, that I don't spend too much time, you know, on making one and then the others don't really fit together with that. So I went and duplicated that 2 times, and I then used the polygon mirror function, which you can again access via the shift right click menu. If you hold down shift and you right click, there's an option for mirror polygons, and you can choose in which axes you want to mirror this, whether it's positive or negative. Again, I took some faces, I duplicated those faces, and I tried to scale it in, and I saw that it's actually creating a weird looking shape, and that's usually because of the direct connection between the parent object and the duplicate face object. A lot of times when you're duplicating faces, you're actually causing the model to extract certain information and still have its original transform node attached to it. What this causes is some sort of issue where the child object, being the pillow that we're making now, is actually morphing in according to its original parent, and that's something that you don't want. The quick fix for that is just clearing the history on the parent object and the child, and then just unparent the child shape from the parent, and that will allow you to freeform or move the object. So I'm refining the shape and I'm extruding the volumes, trying to match them according to the reference, and I'm adding extra supports to see how the shape maintains the volume. And I felt like in the back it needs to be a nice and tight shape, but in the front it should be a lot more rounder. So I ended up taking that extra support edge out, and that felt like it's a much better result. And I kept on refining it, trying to scale it up, and then eventually I got to the point where I've got the shape that I can then duplicate across to the other side. I went, lined it up, trying to match it, constant refinement, and there we go. So I used the duplicate tool, and then I used the alignment tool, which you can find under the modify menu. and then that allows me to align it to the center of another object's pivot. And I started grouping things. I organized them according to pillows, to base of the couch, and then stilts or supports. And there we go, we're essentially almost done. We have a few extra pieces. I completely forgot about the side, so what I've done there is, again, I've done the quick duplicate faces, and I extracted the shape from its parent object, and I used the Shift Extrude edges tool, which you can access as soon as you have an edge selected and you're inside the modeling toolkit. Just hold down Shift and click and drag, and that's allowing me to extrude those edges. And I'm refining these edges until I get a shape that I like, and when I'm done, I'm going to take that and then inflate it, or rather, shall I say, extrude the faces to give it volume, and then that will then become the pillow. I'm refining the edges, trying to get a more natural kind of blend, getting that to fit better and closer to the original base of the couch. Okay, and I'm adding extra supports. I'm rounding out the shapes, seeing how the volumes kind of fit together, and then constantly evaluating. Okay, it's added support edges. I'm going to take it out again, and then push along the normals, and then adding that extra support, pulling that up and out, give it a slightly cleaner look, pull it down just to round out the curvature, and that gave me a nice result. And all I have to do now is give it some roundedness. So if I remember correctly, I turned on the sculpt geometry tool and then inflated the normals along the sides just to give it more a rounder kind of natural feeling. Okay, great. So I've added that to the group, and I duplicated that across, free transformed everything, and then made a mirror copy to the other side, and then I eventually reversed the normals. So as soon as you duplicate an object negatively and you don't have the two-sided lighting turned on, it's actually going to show one side as black and the other side as gray, and that's a typical thing that you want to be aware of, so that you can see if your normals are reversed and pointing inwards. Essentially, you want the gray shaded side to always point up towards the camera. Just a quick tip there. So I eventually just scaled them up a bit, and I used a technique called the transform component, which again you can access via the shift right click menu. If you select the components, whether it's faces, edges or vertices, you can do shift right click and then go into component mode. That will then kind of or transform the components along their local normal space, and then that's going to push out each along their own direction, and that gives you a nice inflation effect just to get the gap filled between those pillows. I ended up grouping things according to their sets of information. So I took everything, grouped that, and called that pillow group, and then took the stilts, I put them under their own layer, and then called the base geo, and finally I grouped all of that together and called it couch group. I then got rid of everything that's unnecessary, cleaned it up. At this point I decided to get rid of the image plane, organize my pivot, snap it to the bottom of the post, the leg post, and then grid snap that to the bottom. added some plane, and just for fun played a bit with the lights. So I created my lights, and I looked through the lights using the panel there at the top. If you go to panels and say look through selected, you're actually viewing right through the spotlight as if it's a camera, and you can kind of place the spotlight this way. I then took the light, scaled it up a bit so it's slightly easier to see, and I moved it to the other side, and then started changing some colors just to give it some interesting look. One side blue and the other side more orange, just to kind of get a nice blend between those. And that's about it. I think I'll definitely see you guys in the next video, and I hope you found this useful and was informative. And I'll definitely see you guys next time.